I recently watched the anime adaptation of Naoki Urasawa's Monster for the first time. Aside from its interesting premise, commitment to tension, and almost painstaking level of detail when it came to its characters, I think Monster's strongest suit comes from its themes. Urasawa does a tremendous job of packing a lot of them into this epic, and while many a video essay has covered most of them, something that I think could be explored further is the idea of how powerful a story can be in influencing people's lives. For those who don't know about this critically acclaimed manga and anime, I'll give you a brief synopsis of the story's opening arc. Monster is a psychological crime drama about a brilliant Japanese neurosurgeon, Dr. Kenzo Tenma, who chooses to save a boy's life over the life of the city's mayor because he was admitted to the hospital first. The mayor perishes alongside Dr. Tenma's social standing, but it's all okay because he did the right thing by choosing to save the patient who came to him first. Right? Well, unlucky for Dr. Tenma, the boy who he saved, Johann Liebert, grows up to be a horrifying serial killer in Germany and inadvertently frames Dr. Tenma for one of his crimes 10 years after he first saves him. Tenma goes on the run and resolves to hunt down Johann and clear his name. Now, if you haven't seen Monster and that premise enticed you, then shut off this video right now and go and read or watch it. There will be spoilers for the entire of Monster throughout this video. For those staying with me, however, I'd just like to give a massive shout out to CG and his incredible 5-hour long analysis and breakdown of Monster. His video helped me a lot to understand this complex story, and I'll be drawing a lot of ideas from it to aid some of my own in this exploration. Whether you're a seasoned or recent fan of Monster or Urasawa, I'd heavily recommend you go check CG out. Last thing to say before we get started is that, as always, it is incredibly difficult to get anime and manga past the copyright bots, so there will be times where I'll have had to distort the visuals to get this video uploaded. I wouldn't say that Monster is exactly the prettiest looking story, but just know that it still pains me to have done some of the things I had to do for this video. With all that housekeeping out of the way, however, let's get down to it. I'm John from the Author's Anvil, and here is how Urasawa's Monster explores the power of storytelling. So I'm actually going to start off by talking about one of Monster's other main themes, the importance of identity.
I am a Japanese man.
There are many characters throughout the story that make it clear to us how the loss or absence of identity has hugely affected them. The villain of the story, for example, doesn't actually know his true name. He was given the name Johann by General Wolf, who found him and his sister wandering around in the wilderness when they were children. We later find out from their mother that she did have names for them, but due to the eugenics experiments and the manipulations of Klaus Pope, who we'll get to later on in this video, she is unable to tell them what they are. Johann spends the story lamenting this, and his lack of having a coherent identity is one of the many factors that contribute to him feeling like a monster. When you don't have a name, especially as a child, it's easy to think that you don't belong to any family or people. Whether we like it or not, names tie us to a culture or community in a universally recognised way. We can often tell what part of the world someone is from simply by just knowing their surname. So for Johann, who doesn't know his true name, as a child we can understand why he doesn't feel as though he belongs anywhere. And when you don't belong anywhere, you can start to feel disconnected from people. And when you feel disconnected from people, it becomes a lot easier to do horrific things to them. Another character whose identity is a crucial aspect to them is Karl. Although just a side character in the Munich arc of the story, we come to deeply understand his conflicts, desires, and pain through the use of his identity. He is the legitimate son of the infamous Hans Schuwald, a wealthy economist who becomes an unwitting part of Johann's machinations. When we meet Karl in the story, he is aware of who his real father is, though Schuwald has no idea who he is. He spends a lot of the Munich arc trying to get close to Schuwald, trying to see if he would be a worthwhile father to him. He has two loving foster parents who treat him as a legitimate son, so he could just embrace that identity of being one of the Newmans, but he always feels this pull towards his true identity as Schuwald's heir. Just a reminder everyone that this character is a side character for 1 or 2 arcs of our story, and the amount of care that Urasawa put into fleshing him out and making us root for him is truly remarkable. There are many other characters who grapple with the idea of identity, but if I were to list them all we'd be here for hours. I simply wanted to demonstrate what an important theme it was before I tie it into the theme that I'm exploring in this video. So how does storytelling fit into identity? Well, a lot of our identity comes from the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. Now, I don't mean objective facts such as I'm a marketing manager or I have blonde hair, I mean character traits and things that happen in our lives. We tell ourselves positive stories such as I am a great writer or I baked a delicious cake for my friends today, but we're also equally capable of telling negative stories such as I'm not good enough and my boss doesn't like me. Depending on how we perceive the events that happen to us dictates whether the story is good or bad or neutral. And these stories thus hugely shape our identities. If you find yourself telling a lot of bad stories about yourself, then you're likely to not be a very self-confident person. In contrast, arrogant people are arrogant because they constantly tell themselves overly positive stories about themselves. Our perceptions of events affect the stories we tell ourselves about the event, which affect our identities. Monster demonstrates this a lot with several of its characters. Dr. Tenma's philosophy that all lives are equal under the knife of a surgeon is a story that he tells himself to justify saving Johann's life. And it is a core part of his identity that makes him hesitant to use a gun throughout the show. When he shoots Roberto in Munich's library, this identity is shattered for him. He tells himself the story that he murdered Roberto and thus is no longer worthy of being called a doctor, when in actual fact he shot Roberto purely out of self-defense when he had no other choice. I think most people would objectively still call him a doctor despite this act, but Tenma tells a different story to himself which thus changes his identity. Grimmer is another character whose identity is linked to the stories that he tells himself. Grimmer tells us that as a kid he watched a television program called The Magnificent Steiner about a kid who, whenever is in danger, blacks out and is saved by a mysterious superhero. Similar things seem to happen to Grimmer, where whenever he's in danger, he blacks out and wakes up with his enemies defeated. It's only at the end of the story where he fully comes to terms with what actually happens. Whenever he's in danger or he's angry, an alternative personality emerges from him and brutally takes care of whoever is threatening him. Really, the parallel story of the Magnificent Steiner that he always told himself and others about was a subconscious cover for him to live with the guilt of what he can do to people. He isn't the innocent boy from the TV show, he's the monster that comes to kill whatever is in his path. Again, the story he's told himself about himself has had a powerful impact on his identity. So given how much the stories we tell ourselves can affect our behaviour and personality, it is then an easy, logical step to say that the stories we tell about other people can also affect them, especially when it comes to children. One of the darker parts of Monster's story is a chapter where Johann, disguised as Nina, manipulates an innocent orphan, Milos, into seeking out his mother. He tells the boy that if he goes to the nearby red light district and calls out for his mother, then one of two things will happen. Either his mother will call back and reunite with him because she loves him, or she won't call back because she never loved him and doesn't want a son. Of course, Johann knows that this orphan's mother is probably either dead or long gone, but he tells Milos this narrative in order to expose him to the darkest side of humanity, to give him a taste of what Johann felt when he was a child. It is an incredibly sadistic story to tell an innocent child, and after Milos goes through a harrowing evening trying to find his mother amongst whores, drug dealers and thieves, it's enough to bring him to suicide. Luckily Tenma and Grimmer arrive in time to save him, but again this episode demonstrates the power that ideas presented as stories can have on people. Johann doesn't just torture and manipulate people by telling them uncomfortable truths about themselves. He nearly always wraps it into a wider narrative or provides a full context as to why those truths are so impactful. This can be seen when he confronts Detective Richard Brown on the rooftop and reveals the truth of Brown's alcoholism, something that had gripped the detective's identity for so long. I find it fascinating that Urasawa gave Johann, the villain of our story, such an ability. Storytellers are usually depicted as wise or kindly mentor figures, but Monster subverts that trope in order to show us how powerful stories really are. And speaking of storytellers, let's now have a look at one of the most important characters in Monster, Franz Bonaparte. How could I make a video such as this without talking about Franz Bonaparte and the storybooks he writes? Now, just a quick disclaimer about this section of the video, Franz Bonaparte goes by several aliases and pen names throughout the story, including Jakob Weierbeck and Klaus Pope. I've chosen to use the Franz Bonaparte name for him as it's the one that's most commonly used by other characters and seems to be how most of the fandom refer to him as well. But anyways, throughout Monster we are given little hints and teasers about a collection of children's storybooks that seem to have a big impact on Johann and his twin sister Nina. If you watch the anime adaptation of Monster, you'll even be treated to a drawn animation of one of these picture books in the credits after each episode. The most prominent storybooks written by Bonaparte are The God of Peace, which is read to Nina by Bonaparte's long-lost son Jaromir Lipski in episode 56 of the anime. The Man with the Big Eyes and the Man with the Big Mouth, which is also read to Nina by Lipski in episode 56 of the anime. Das Roenheim, which is read to Tenma by Bonaparte's editor in episode 56 of the anime. And then of course there is The Nameless Monster, which is first fully read by Nina to Lottie in episode 37 of the anime. I'm not actually going to go too deeply into what these storybooks mean. There are again countless videos that explore the themes and deeper meaning behind Bonaparte's stories. What I am going to explore and praise, however, is the impact that these storybooks have on the plot, and how they once again demonstrate the power that stories have on us. Franz Bonaparte is not a very pleasant man. In fact, I would agree with what CG says in his video in that he really is the titular monster of Monster, not Johann. His background is in psychiatry, psychology, and neuroscience, and he uses these skills to become a master brainwasher and manipulator. He, along with Peter Chapek, is the one who sets the entire story of Monster in motion. It is his eugenics experiment that creates Johann and Nina, and his mental twisting that heavily affects the psyche of both children. After the eugenics experiment goes wrong and the children escape, he goes into hiding in Germany and spends the rest of his life pretending to be someone else because he feels so guilty about what he did. However, he never does anything to properly atone. He doesn't start a charity or help orphaned children or seek out Johann and Nina for forgiveness. Nope, he just hides out in Ruhenheim until Johann finds him and then dies a coward without ever having accepted public responsibility for his crimes. Seriously, screw Bonaparte. But anyway, back when he was still running his eugenics project, he hosted readings of storybooks that he had written at the Red Rose Mansion for the children of the experiments. I think it's pretty clear that his books were another method of psychological brainwashing. There is something unsettling about each of the books. The drawings are crudely drawn, the colours garish, and the subject matter sometimes crude. You could say that they're brimming with malice. As we've discussed, stories can have a tremendous impact on how someone views themselves and the world, and so reading children these kinds of stories would absolutely shape their personalities. The only story that actually has a clear moral is Das Ruhenheim, which was almost certainly written by Bonaparte after abandoning the eugenics experiment, and thus wouldn't have been one of the books read to the children. A common thread in the other books is that the world is cruel, confusing, and filled with monsters and devils. Putting on my theory hat for a minute, I believe that he wove these themes into the stories in order to brainwash the children into obeying authority. Look how cruel and confusing the world is, kids, so that's why you should follow an authority figure like me who can tell you what to do and how to think so that you don't have to. The readings at the Red Rose Mansion were not just for determining who was smarter than who, but also for establishing control. What I like so much about the Bonaparte books is that they are not just devices for Urasawa to help flesh out his character and inject abstract themes into Monster. If they were just that, then that'd still be great, as they do get the audience to think more deeply about the characters in our story, but the books also crucially serve to further the plot. A lot of Johann's psyche is warped because of them. He relates to the nameless monster without even realising it until he rediscovers a copy of it in the Munich University Library. If we are to subscribe to CG's theory, which I personally do, then this psychological reaction he has, and the subsequent memories that come with it, triggers a huge change in Johann. From this point on, he becomes focused on discovering his past rather than pursuing Schuwald's power, and eventually resolves to commit his perfect suicide because of it. The protagonists in Monster also use the Bonaparte books to understand and track down Johann throughout the story. Dr. Tenma deduces that Bonaparte is hiding out in Ruhenheim because he finds the copy of Das Ruhenheim from the publisher. Inspector Lunge's shift into believing that Johann is indeed real is because he has a copy of the Nameless Monster translated for him in the Czech Republic. It thus cannot be overstated how important the Bonaparte books are to Monster's story. They affect the plot, the characters, and the themes all in one, and again I have to praise Urasawa for his creativity here. He could have just had one of these books be a clue to Johann's past or Bonaparte's whereabouts, but instead all the books come and go throughout the story to stimulate both the characters and the audience's curiosity. It's clear that the creators of the anime understood this too, otherwise they would have done something different for the outro credits of each episode. The theme of how stories can be used for both good and evil is something really unique to Monster, and came as a pleasant surprise to me upon viewing. It's just one of the many themes that is very thoroughly explored throughout the story, and shown in many different ways. Stories are not just threaded in with Bonaparte's books, and not just used to explore identity, but are also shown to affect how we judge crimes. Grimmer tells a false story to the Czech police department in order to clear Detective Suk's name. The lawyer Fritz Werdemann tells stories of how his father was falsely convicted of spying in order to motivate himself to being a just lawyer. Monster gets us to think about the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell other people, and as a writer myself, it really highlighted to me the responsibility that storytellers have to other people. and that's pretty neat coming from a psychological crime drama. I suppose Monster also serves as a bit of a warning about mindlessly consuming stories and writing. I guess watch out folks for consuming bad content that brainwashes you into doing something morally reprehensible. Thanks as always for watching. Check out my other videos about writing and superhero media and philosophy and whatever else I feel like rambling about. Hope you all have a wonderful day and keep writing.